Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the content director and the host, and joining me today to talk about an exciting topic is the great Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop Barron, welcome.
Hey, Brandon. Always good to be with you.
You as well. Now listen, we're going to be talking about maybe the most discussed, hottest book in the Catholic world, at least this year. It's called the Benedict Option. But before we get into that, I want to update our many friends and followers about an exciting announcement that we've made regarding the next round of our Pivotal Players film series. We've released Volume 1, Pivotal Players Volume 1, which featured 6 different pivotal players. Right now we're working on Volume 2. Tell us about who is going to be featured in Volume 2.
Yeah, well, I've done 4 scripts already for that, so those are done. That's the St. Ignatius of Loyola, and we have St. Benedict, we have St. Augustine, and we have Bartolome de las Casas. Those 4 are finished. And we've decided now, after some going back and forth and assessing different, pros and cons, that we're going to do videos on the great Flannery O'Connor, I think the finest Catholic fiction writer of the 20th century, and then the great Fulton Sheen, who is, I think, truly a pivotal player when it comes to what we're doing now, this use of the new media. So Flannery and Fulton are the last 2 of the pivotal players.
And of course, we'll have a lot more on each of these 2 figures in the months to come, but maybe give us the 1 or 2 sentence summary of why each of these 2 figures are a pivotal player.
Yeah, well, Sheen, I think I just said it, that without Sheen, we wouldn't have pivoted into this use of the media in the broad sense. I think Sheen, who knew the world of books and ideas extremely well, the old forms, but with enthusiasm embraced the new forms of communication, and that makes him, I think, a bridge figure into what we have now. So I think he is truly pivotal that way. Flannery O'Connor, as I say, in my mind, the greatest Catholic fiction writer of the last century, and someone who wrote for our time, which is to say a time that's growing increasingly deaf to things religious. Her vision, which was inspired in part by the American South, she called it a Christ-haunted country, but also very much by the Catholic faith, is one that we need now. I think if we want to communicate through the arts to a skeptical society, Flannery is a pivotal figure in that outreach.
So we're going to start filming those within the next few months here, the Volume 2 of Pivotal Players. So to keep up to date on the series and to learn more about it, be sure to visit pivotalplayers.com. Now today, again, we're going to be talking about the Benedict Option. This is a proposal put forward by Rod Dreher, and it carries a new best-selling book by the same name. But there's actually several books that have all sort of simultaneously debuted here. We have Archbishop Chaput's book, Strangers in a Strange Land, Anthony Esselin's book called Out of the Ashes, Rusty Reno's book, Resurrecting the Idea of a Christian Society, and Rod Dreher's book, The Benedict Option. They all cover similar terrain here, Bishop, and one thing that they all share in common is something that's been dubbed the new alarmism. Tell us about that. I mean, a lot of these men are sounding the alarm bells. Do you think things are really as bad as many of them are saying?
Well, I don't know how to answer that succinctly. I like all these people. I admire all these men. And in fact, I wrote a blurb, I think, for Archbishop Chaput's book. I read Rusty Reno's book. I've been reading him for a long time. Rod Dreher's book I just finished. And these are all very good people, smart people, who are seeing something that's gone really wrong with our society. Are they right about that? Yeah, I think they are right about that. There's something has gone really wrong with our society. Now, how much of good is left and, how much can we salvage and all that, we can debate till the cows come home. But that there is something that's uniquely wrong with the culture now, I think they're all correctly identifying that, yeah.
Well, in this episode, I want to focus specifically on Rod Dreher's book. It's kind of the pivot point for a lot of these other ones, the Benedict Option. The Benedict Option. First, what are your initial thoughts about the Benedict Option itself as an idea? What do you think about it? And maybe give us a brief overview of what it's proposing.
Yeah, named for Saint Benedict, the great 6th century figure who at the time when the Roman Empire had collapsed and culture really had bottomed out, and there was tremendous corruption, moral, political, and otherwise. Saint Benedict famously withdraws, first of all, to a cave, living as a hermit. In time, people are drawn to him. He becomes the father of this, what we now call the monastic movement in the West, which not only saved the church, but in many ways saved society. And so that gives you the clue. I totally agree with those who are saying, don't blame Rod, or don't ascribe to Rod Dreher the view that we should all just run to the hills. It's just time for Christians to run away. No, it's time for Christians, he thinks, to regroup. The way Benedict did back in the 6th century. A kind of withdrawal, yes, because you got to step away from a culture that's grown extremely corrupt. A regrouping, a rediscovery of our basic identity so that, and here's an important side of it, I think, so that we can then have a civilization building impact on the world around us. So don't forget that part of the Benedict option. It's not just run to the hills or go to a cave and hide, though that's part of it, a certain withdrawal and discovery of identity, but so that you can become the seeds of a renewed civilization. I think he wants both sides of that to be clearly emphasized.
Rod Dreher's been promoting this Benedict option for several years through different blog posts and articles. This book is kind of his fuller explanation and detail of what it includes. I want to spend some time going through the specific proposals in the book, but before we get there, first talk a little bit more about Saint Benedict. I mentioned here at the outset that for the next volume of your Pivotal Player series, we're doing a whole episode on St. Benedict. So you've spent lots and lots of time researching St. Benedict. Do you think he's a good model for Christians today? And how can St. Benedict help solve our 21st century problems?
Yeah, he's a good model in the measure he's a saint. So all the saints are always good models, for us. But Benedict, more specifically, as I say, it's that rhythm that at a time of great cultural crisis, he had the instinct to hunker down. And again, I know that language, don't hunker down behind walls, but to hunker down so as to recover what I would call the evangelical basics. So a culture that had grown so corrupt that people were just kind of lost. And I mean, literally adrift. Think of all the people kind of drifting around the ruins of Roman society. So Benedict said, it's time for us, and it's a small group. I mean, think of the monks he first gathered around him, a small group of people who would live their Christianity intentionally, intensely, and radically, if I can put it that way. That was the needful thing at the moment. From that seed, even though I don't think St. Benedict would have seen this, if you asked St. Benedict, are you here reviving Western civilization? He probably would have looked at you puzzled. He said, I'm living the Christian life in this intense, radical, and intentional way so as to preserve something. So as to preserve something in a time of crisis. And I think in that measure, yes, he's of extreme value today for us. And that's what Rod Dreher sees, is it's something like what Benedict did. Now, there still are, of course, Benedictine monks who have literally gone to monasteries and lived their life. He's not recommending that everyone become a monk, but he recommends that something like a Benedictine form of life might be good for all serious Christians.
When it comes to this rhythm, you've often used the analogy of Noah's Ark. Talk about that.
Yeah, and the church fathers saw that very clearly. So think of the Noah's Ark story begins at a time of cultural and moral collapse, right? The world has just fallen into sin. The floodwaters in the Bible, ancient peoples were afraid of the water, The Jews are desert people, and they would venture onto the water only when they absolutely had to. And they would hug the shore typically. They were afraid of the water. It was always a symbol of chaos and destruction, right? So the floodwaters symbolize the collapse of a society, of a civilization. What does God do? But he sends this rescue operation in the form of this great boat, which is why the church fathers saw Noah's Ark as symbolic of the church. So on the ark, what's preserved but a microcosm of God's good order. So think now of all the animals. I don't literalize that story, but it's a very powerful symbolic story. All the animals and so on. Under the leadership of Noah, it's a little microcosm of what God wants for the whole world. But listen, during the flood, they had to hunker down. They had to get on this boat. And everyone thinks, oh, come on, what are you doing building a boat in the middle of the desert? Are you out of your mind? Are you crazy? Well, yeah, but that's how they survived. They hunkered down for a period of time. But then when the floodwaters receded, they unleashed the life. See, and that's the rhythm. The purpose was not to stay hunkered down in the boat and float around for all eternity. The purpose was to become a seed, which when the propitious moment had presented itself, could be planted efficaciously. So that's the church fathers' view of the rhythm of the church's life, is we got to hunker down sometimes in the life of the church, but then open the windows, open the doors, let it out. Can I just suggest this, that what Chaput and Esselin and Dreher and company are saying is we are kind of at a moment when we might have to get on the ark for a time. And that's not to say, oh, I'm running to hills and oh, I'm giving up and oh, I'm just a crazy extremist. It's to say, no, this might be a moment when we got to do some hunkering down if we want eventually to let out the life that will renew the society.
Now, as you were reading Rod Dreher's book, The Benedict Option, you also said that you were reminded of the identity relevance dilemma, balancing these two things. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, Brandon, it's a dilemma that I think will remain until the eschaton, because it's so hard to get that just right. Identity. Who are we? What do we stand for? What are the walls that define us, right? If you hyper-stress that, you end up losing contact with the wider culture. You become more irrelevant to it. There is a hunkering down that's become extreme, right? On the other hand, if you hyper-stress relevance, so our impact on the culture, evangelization, outreach, I'm always listening, I'm always seeing the good side of the culture, the danger is that you lose your distinctiveness. Now, I would argue in my lifetime, my time in the church after the council, we hyper-stressed relevance. In fact, that word has become this sort of almost comical cliche, right? And it's not relevant, man, and let's make my homilies relevant. And we did put a huge stress on the outreach to the culture, read the signs of the times, listen to the other voices, etc. But now for a couple generations, I think we've compromised our sense of identity. Who are we? What does it mean to be a Catholic Christian? What are we for? What are the walls that legitimately define us? So as I say, this side of the eschaton, we're never going to get it completely right, but we tend to kind of oscillate back and forth rhythmically. Maybe in the 60s and 70s, that was the right move because we had hyper-stressed identity. Talk to Catholics, from the 40s and 50s, and they would probably say something like that, like, yeah, we were too closed off. We were too hyper concerned about preserving our traditions. And okay, so we oscillated toward relevance. Does anyone doubt now that we probably hyper stressed relevance to the expense of identity? And I wouldn't argue with that. As I read these authors, they're saying it's time for identity. And that's the hunkering down, if you want. That's the Noah's Ark moment or the Benedict Option moment, is to recover a keen sense of who we are, lest we become just one more echo of the wider culture.
You also noted in a recent article on the Benedict Option that maybe 75 years before we're having this discussion now, there lived a man who, in many ways, lived out this Benedict Option in his own culture of Poland, and that was the young Karol Wojtyła. Talk about how he sort of responded to his declining culture there.
Yeah, to me, he's fascinating because he hits both sides, and part of his spiritual genius was he was able to handle the identity relevance dilemma with such deftness and grace. So go back to when he was 19 and the Nazis overrun his native Poland and his beloved Krakow, right? And they decapitate Polish society. They enslave the society, basically. It's one of the darkest cultural nights in 1,000 years. Descended upon Poland as Karol Wojtyła was a young guy. And of course, they're succeeded by the perhaps mildly less tyrannical and oppressive communists. So one of the darkest nights culturally ever descended upon young Karol Wojtyła. What did he do? Well, he didn't fight it directly. He had no resources, etc. But he resisted it by forming this little group called the Rhapsodic Theater. Young friends who would gather behind the locked doors and shut windows, and they would clandestinely recite Polish poetry. And I always find that image, gosh, very moving. You say, what a waste of time. The Nazis are killing people, and you're reciting poetry? But see, what was he doing with his friends? But he was hunkering down so as to preserve something, even in his own soul, to preserve something, which was the Catholic faith that was ingredient in that great literature. And so he intuited the right move. It was kind of a Benedict Option move. It's time to flee to the hills. In his case, it meant a locked room in Krakow. Now, push a little bit further. He's now a young priest. The communists are in charge. A dark night is still all over that culture. What does he do? Takes his friends as young people out to camping trips and kayaking trips, and he forms them in Aquinas and John of the Cross and the Bible. And he knew they had all been so malformed by the communist propaganda machine that he had to hunker down with them. And read George Weigel's books and others about how they did it, often cleverly outwitting the communist spies and so on. But they were doing the Benedict Option, seems to me, Now, fast forward a few more decades, that young priest is now the Pope, and he unleashes what he had preserved. So now the moment was different, the cultural moment. Nazis are long gone, thank God. Communists are still there, but he senses there's a weakness, there's a moment. And so with his young friends, now come of age, he speaks the truth about God and about human rights and about dignity and freedom. And he unleashes, it's like Noah's Ark, he unleashes the life he had preserved. That's the rhythm. And look at the papacy of Karol Wojtyła. Was there anybody who was stronger on Catholic identity than Karol Wojtyła? Love the Catholic faith, intellectual tradition, artistic tradition, boldly living it, love public religion. But at the same time, was there anybody on the world stage better at relevance than Karol Wojtyła, at the reaching out to the wider world, reaching out to a variety of cultures, using different cultural forms in the liturgy, speaking the language of Jefferson when he's in America, et cetera, et cetera. That's his genius in some ways. He was able to keep that balance in a way that we lesser souls often don't. We'll do one or the other. I think of many people that formed me when I was a kid were so strong on the relevance thing that they just forgot about identity, I see Chaput, Dreher, and company as they're urging this important corrective, that it might be the moment for greater identity.
Well, you're listening to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the host. I'm here with Bishop Robert Barron. We're discussing the Benedict Option. Now, one thing that both fans and critics of Rod Dreher's proposal of the Benedict Option have clamored for over the years is more specifics. We've been talking here in generalities about how to respond to the culture, hunkering down. But his new book with the same title, The Benedict Option, really goes into the particularities of what that might look like on the ground. So I wanted to run through a few of these and just get your thoughts, maybe almost rapid fire here. One of the first things in the book he proposes is that we need to pull back on political engagement, that the problems with our culture aren't going to be solved primarily politically. What's your take on that?
Yeah, and again, this is a hyper complicated issue, and we have to talk all day about it. I'll say this very quick thing about it. The Battle of Gallipoli in World War I, the famous disaster, right, when under Churchill's direction, Allied troops were poured into this particular part near the Dardanelles, and mostly New Zealand and Australian troops, which is why it's such an important battle to this day in the Australian culture. Well, it was an utter disaster. I mean, people just killed in the thousands. And they kept pouring troops into this battle until finally it became clear to Churchill and others that this is not going to work. This is a really bad use of men, material, energy, resources, etc. Right? And so they regrouped and they redirected and they gave up that battle. Now, I've used it as a metaphor because those who withdrew from Gallipoli were not saying, oh, let's forget World War I. This is a waste of time. They weren't saying, oh, the Kaiser's great, let's leave him in power. They were saying the way we're conducting the war in this regard is not very productive. It's not very useful. Let's redirect our energies elsewhere. Okay. Now, I use it as a metaphor because when it comes to the battles, if you want, of the church in the wider culture, can we sometimes fall into a Gallipoli situation where we start pouring so much money, energy, material, persons, and so on and so forth into a given battle that is just not going well? We're not going to win that battle. And might it be better to pivot strategically into another front? So now, pick various issues if you want. I've spoken just recently about the gay marriage question. And is the church against gay marriage? Yes. Would society be better without it? Yes. Is the best way right now to battle gay marriage in the courts and legally in a direct frontal assault? I and others, I think Dreher might be in this category, would suggest that might be a Gallipoli moment, that maybe that would be not the best strategic option. And maybe we ought to pivot, not away from the battle, not away from the war or its purpose, but pivot in a strategically creative way. Okay. I think that's one way to talk about the political challenge. As I read Dreher, and I think I'm with him on a lot of this, that maybe we need a different moment, a different strategy when it comes to battling some of these cultural forms. Part of it could be, and what I've called for too, is a greater witness, greater education of our own people, and a living out of the values in a very provocative way. So anyway, that's one simple thought on a hyper complicated issue.
Next up, Rod Dreher, in his book, The Benedict Option, suggests that Christians need to pull back into intentional Christian communities, somewhat isolated from the mainstream culture. He gives several real-world examples of this happening all over the country where not just Catholics, but Christians of the lower O Orthodox persuasion gather together, they help each other, they live their lives together. What do you think about that idea?
I like it. I think it's good. How many people, I've asked folks this sometimes, how many people in your line of work, in your neighborhood, in your circle of friends, even know that you're a Catholic? And very often the answer is, oh, well, anyone knows, or, I never talk about it. Well, I mean, can that possibly be good, that we have so many people, Catholics, who have like zero familial and cultural and neighborhood support for the life they're living? Wouldn't it lead, in fact, exactly where it has led, to a complete privatization of the faith? It's a little flame that I keep burning deep down inside of me. But see, the Christian faith is never meant to be lived that way, and it won't survive long that way. So I rather like that idea of Christians coming together, and I like that word too, intentionally, with a purpose in mind, that we want to support each other in our Christianity, especially when the cultures on moral issues and others has turned so dramatically against us. Now, not only is the culture opposed intellectually to our positions, it's politically aggressive toward us. It's using political means to silence and ostracize us, So I think that's a good thing if Christians can do it in a way, and here's the caution, obviously, that doesn't become hyper defensive, doesn't become, let's go retreat into the hutch sort of thing. But for mutual support, yeah, something along the lines of Karol Wojtyła's Rhapsodic Theater, yeah, I get that. The preservation of our great values, teaching to our kids, praying together, supporting each other, yeah, and those are all good things.
Dreher devotes a whole chapter to education and how Christians should live out a new model of education. One of the things that he somewhat controversial recommends is that most, or maybe even all, parents pull their kids out of public schools. And instead, he favors classical education schools. He favors homeschooling, curriculum based on the great books, the humanities. What's your take on all that?
Yeah, and I really rather get you talking about it because you've got more direct experience with it. Let me say a word about homeschooling. When I was a kid, young man, if you had said homeschooling, first of all, we wouldn't know what you were talking about. If you explained it, because no one ever used that phrase. I remember the first time I ever heard it, I thought, what do you mean homeschooling? I don't understand what that means. And our reaction would have been, I can guarantee you, entirely negative. We would have thought it was fussy and weird and turned in, and what about the poor kids, and they won't be socialized right, and we would have seen it as a very weird thing. But here's what I find interesting: the very fact that you and now many other families have opted for it, in some ways, is proving Dreher's claim that the culture has so radically shifted. In my time, almost no one would have seen the need for it, because we would have seen a culture that was largely in agreement on these great moral issues. We would not have seen public schools that were aggressively secularist. We wouldn't have seen attacks on religious people going on. So the very fact that you and lots of other very sensible and decent people have seen the need for it proves his point in some ways. The culture has shifted that dramatically. Now, obviously, people of goodwill, people just as smart and pious and good as you and your wife, have opted not to do that. So, I mean, I get it. On the ground, it depends on all kinds of factors, I suppose. But I understand. I know a lot of people who homeschool their kids. And I know a lot of seminarians I've taught who came from a homeschool background. Well, I understand it. I get it. The classical thing, too, I'm very intrigued by it. There's a couple examples here in my own pastoral region in Santa Barbara, schools that have really been revived under this rubric, which is a very conscious, unapologetic embrace of the great Catholic, Western, intellectual, and artistic tradition. And teaching the kids at a high level. The Augustine Academy out here in Ventura, which is a half hour from my house, I visited 6th grade classrooms where they're reading Dante. I've visited 8th grade classrooms where they're putting on A Man for All Seasons. I visited high school classrooms that are, reading the Summa of Aquinas. Good. I like that. Our education in general is in serious trouble. Our Catholic education has been suffering for a long time. So the classics of Western culture, I'm all for it. Especially when we're living in a time when there's a multiculturalism that has flattened a lot of things out. Again, I got nothing in the world against reading and studying things from a variety of cultures, but when you're driven by an ideology of multiculturalism, you're going to sacrifice quality for quantity, if I can put it that way. To get as many voices, in the conversation, you're going to sacrifice Homer and Shakespeare and Dante and T.S. Eliot and, to my mind, that's too high a price to pay. So to that degree, I like the classical Christian schools a lot.
Here's something that I want to get your thoughts on. I know a lot of other people do because we get emails and phone calls about this specific question a lot. And it's the question about choosing a profession. Rod devotes another whole chapter to this question. He says that for a lot of Christians who are moving into fields such as business or medicine or science, they're going to increasingly face challenges to their faith that are going to have to make a decision whether they remain firm in their Christian identity or whether they'll sort of capitulate to the demands of progressive secularism. What would you recommend to young people who are maybe in college and they're thinking about what sorts of jobs they need to pursue? Rob sort of recommends that for many of these people, maybe they should eschew those types of professions in favor of what he calls hard labor jobs. He has a line in there saying nobody ever asked a plumber to sign a diversity statement or something like that. What's your take on the whole question of jobs?
Yeah. And I know it's complicated because whatever I say, people say, well, but you're not looking at this. So I get that. What comes to my mind, though, is my friend, Dr. Billy Shavira in Phoenix. And Dr. Billy, who's a OBGYN, and begins his career, in the kind of the standard way. And then he gets a challenge from Bishop Tom Olmsted one day that, I think you should really do your practice in a way that's totally in line with Catholic teaching. And he and his wife really faced this crisis of, do we do it? Are we going to lose our practice? I'll lose money. But in fact, he did it. He decided to take the plunge. And I think through the grace of God, he's really more successful than ever, you know. Well, to me, he's a model of how to do that. He's a guy of great prayerfulness, intelligence, deep Catholic sensibility. And he's living his professional life very publicly as a Catholic, you know. So may his tribe increase. You know, I hope there's room always for people like him. And that'd be my hope, I guess, in regard to the professional stuff. But I know there's always exceptions and different things. Manual labor thing, I go back here to Cardinal George. He was always a great advocate of manual labor, that we've lost touch with our bodies, with the world, with nature. It is obviously part of the Benedictine thing, ora et labora. And the labora usually meant hard manual labor, like digging rocks out of fields and plowing and that sort of thing. Okay, I get that. And especially with kids. I think to introduce kids to that kind of hard manual labor is not a bad thing, you know. Think of young Karl Wojtyła working in the quarry. You know, that made a big difference in his own life, that he at one point worked with his hands. And now read Laborem Exercens, his great statement on work. And it's born of someone who didn't spend his whole life in a library, you know, but was out there in a quarry. So I understand that. And I like that. But I guess I go with the Dr. Billy example of someone that can really bring the faith vibrantly into the public forum.
Well, the last chapter in the Benedict Option looks at technology, and Rod Dreher takes a somewhat pessimistic view of technology. He cites many of the obvious concerns, things like pornography and technology addiction, and it seems like he's sort of counseling, especially parents, to be very wary about technology. What's your outlook on the whole thing?
Yeah, first to say a very strong yes to that. I quite agree with it, especially with young people, because I know the pornography thing is really bad. When they say the typical beginning age for pornography use is 11 or 12 now in our culture, which is staggering to me. You know, how your view of human sexuality is going to be skewed if you begin watching pornography, hardcore pornography, when you're 12. So I get that, and I get how technology is used in all kinds of bad ways. I mean, the dark powers will use whatever they can, and they've used this. That parents should be really vigilant about kids' use of technology. Absolutely, I get it. The internet, I mean, you and I both know this. We're involved in the internet. It's a jungle. I mean, there are beautiful tropical birds in that jungle. There are a lot of swamps in that jungle. You know, so you got to be mature enough and nimble enough and spiritually alert enough to make your way through it with a proper guide and with a good machete. And you know what I'm saying? So you have to understand that. Parents monitoring kids as they make their way into that jungle, I think, is very important. The danger is parents go, oh, off you go, enjoy the jungle, you know, and before you know it, they're in some swamp, and before you know it, they're caught in the vines of some tree, you know. So I have a lot of sympathy for that. You know, in time, you and I were both internet people, and we both use technology in a big way. I suppose, you know, everybody's got a shadow side. Cardinal George always taught me that. I mean, he said, whatever you say, there's always a sed contra, right? Thomas Aquinas saying, you know, but on the other hand, so I get that. There's always a sed contra. And the great sed contra to the Benedict option is on view here. You can't be so afraid of it that you don't use it. You can't be so afraid of it that you opt out of that world, which connects you then to all kinds of things and people and enables you to communicate. Is it a jungle? Yeah, but there are tropical birds of great beauty in that jungle. And with the right guidance and maturity, you can find them. And so anyway, maybe I'm overworking that little metaphor. But, you know, that's my basic take on the whole Benedict option thing is a very vigorous yes. And then my Cardinal George said contra in there, too, that we're not meant permanently to hunker down. We're meant to be evangelical. We got to be careful, and we should regroup in certain important ways that we might go out into the world. So as long as all that's in place, I'd say great. You know, off you go.
Well, it's time now for one of our questions from our listeners. If you have a question for Bishop Barron, please send it in to us. We'd love to hear it. Just visit askbishopbarron.com, and when you go there, you can record your question on any device. Today we have a question from Kathleen, and it's really relevant to the whole Benedict Option discussion about how we engage the culture and what our role is as Christians. So here's Kathleen's question for Bishop Barron.
Hi, Bishop Barron. This is Kathleen from Louisiana. When I read the Gospels, I notice that Jesus doesn't seem to make any attempts at political change. We see capital punishment, gender discrimination, and injustice on a number of levels. If we infer that Jesus' mission was outside the realm of politics, how are we to discern our own moral obligations in this area? Thank you.
Well, good question, complicated question, hard to answer in a couple minutes. Here's a quick observation. True, he's not explicitly a political figure the way, for example, a zealot would have been. So we hear one of his disciples, Simon, called the Zealot. Well, the Zealots were a political party in Jesus' time. He's a disciple of the Lord, but the Lord is not, advocating zealotry, or he's taking the zealot position, which was deeply anti-Roman, et cetera, et cetera. Jesus was not explicitly a member of a political party. He wasn't recommending certainly revolutionary action against the Romans. If anything, he's pretty nice to Romans in the Gospels. He says, if you live by the sword, you'll die by the sword. So that's true, that he's not explicitly a political figure. Famously, my kingdom is not of this world, right? So he's proclaiming a kingdom, but not caught up in the nexus of worldly political reality. Having said all that, you also have to say he is indeed teaching a form of life, a way of thought, this kingdom of God that has massive political implications. So even the things you mentioned there, ought Christians to be involved in fighting those things and opposing them? Yeah, informed precisely by the moral and spiritual vision of Jesus. So that, I think, is where the Catholic social teaching tradition comes from, is taking truth from Jesus' prophetic witness and then using those to inform a political point of view. So I think that's the right balance. Think here of John Paul II, who said to priests, I don't want you guys directly involved in government. I don't want you running for Congress or running for political office, but I do indeed want you massively influencing the political conversation through your articulation of the gospel vision. As long as that balance is kind of in place, I think we're doing pretty well.
Well, thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Word on Fire show. Hey, listen, over the next month, we're going to have a couple new guest hosts. One is Joseph Glore. You've heard him on the Word on Fire show a couple times. And then also Jared Zimmerer is going to be hosting a couple of the episodes. Jared is our new Director of Outreach and Mission here at Word on Fire. You're going to love both of them, and we've got some fascinating topics lined up. So be looking forward to those episodes coming up soon. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next week on the Word on Fire show.